The making of The Passion of the Christ. Every studio in Hollywood said no. Not a soft no, not a maybe next year. A flat, unanimous, industry-wide refusal. One of the biggest movie stars on the planet walked into rooms with a finished script, his own money on the table, and an Oscar-winning director attached, himself, and every single executive turned him down. The film would be shot in 2 dead languages. No major stars, no subtitled dialogue trailers, testing well with focus groups. And the subject matter? 12 hours in the life of a man already the most depicted figure in the history of art was, according to the people who passed on it, box office poison. That film went on to earn more than $600 million worldwide, on a budget smaller than the marketing campaign for most summer blockbusters. It became the highest-grossing independent film ever made, and for 20 years, the highest-grossing R-rated release in American history. It also detonated one of the fiercest cultural firestorms in modern Hollywood, dividing critics, clergy, and audiences before a single frame had screened publicly. This is the story of how The Passion of the Christ got made, and why it almost didn't.
The Passion Project. By the early 2000s, Mel Gibson was not a struggling filmmaker looking for a break. He was one of the most bankable stars in the world, an Academy Award-winning director off the strength of Braveheart, and a producer with his own company, Icon Productions, giving him rare creative independence. He had spent years, by his own account, wrestling privately with faith, the product of a strict traditionalist Catholic upbringing under his father, a man whose religious views sat well outside mainstream Catholic teaching. Out of that personal reckoning came an idea Gibson had been circling for years, a film depicting the final 12 hours of Jesus' life, from the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane through the betrayal, the trial, the scourging, and the crucifixion, rendered with unflinching, visceral realism rather than the softened, reverent distance of earlier biblical epics. He didn't want spectacle. He wanted the audience to feel every hour of it. There was just one problem. Nobody in Hollywood.
The Wall of No. The pitch alone was enough to end most meetings. A famously, explicitly violent film about the crucifixion. Dialogue entirely in reconstructed Aramaic and Latin, with no plans, initially, for any subtitles at all. No box office insurance in the form of a recognizable ensemble cast, and a subject so sensitive that any misstep in how it portrayed the gospel accounts risked outrage before release. Every studio Gibson approached passed. Not because they doubted his talent, he had 2 decades of hits behind him, but because the math looked impossible. A subtitled, foreign-language religious film, financed at a level that could sink a studio's quarter if it flopped, built around content most marketing departments didn't know how to sell. So Gibson made a decision that almost nobody in his position makes. He financed it himself.
Betting the house. Gibson put up roughly $30 million of his own money, a modest budget by studio blockbuster standards, but an enormous personal risk for one man to shoulder alone. There was no distributor lined up, no guaranteed release, no safety net. If the film failed, it wouldn't be a line item on a conglomerate's balance sheet. It would be Gibson's money. Gone. He cast Jim Caviezel, a respected but hardly A-list actor, in the role of Jesus, a casting choice that had come to define Caviezel's career in ways he likely never anticipated. Monica Bellucci took the role of Mary Magdalene. Behind the camera, Gibson brought
the firestorm before the release. Long before The Passion of the Christ reached theaters, it was already the most talked-about unreleased film in America, and not entirely for reasons Gibson wanted. Early cuts and script pages circulated to religious scholars, clergy, and media commentators ahead of release, and the reactions split sharply. Some Christian leaders previewed the film and described it as the most powerful cinematic depiction of the crucifixion they had ever seen, and church groups began organizing early block ticket sales for their congregations. Gibson leaned into this grassroots support, screening the film for pastors and religious communities months before its public debut, A marketing strategy no studio playbook would have recommended, and one that built extraordinary word-of-mouth anticipation. But other religious leaders and scholars raised serious concerns. A number of Jewish organizations and interfaith groups warned that certain scenes and dialogue choices echoed long-standing anti-Semitic tropes about collective Jewish responsibility for Christ's death, a charge with a dark history, given how such portrayals had fueled persecution across centuries of European history. Some scholars who reviewed early drafts of the script argued the film leaned on the Gospel of John's account in ways that amplified those tensions. Gibson and his defenders pushed back firmly, maintaining the film was a faithful, non-political adaptation of the Gospel narratives, and that accusations of anti-Semitism were unfounded. The debate played out for months in newspapers, on television, and in church basements, an unusual amount of cultural noise for a film most of the industry had refused to fight.
Opening day? The Passion of the Christ opened on Ash Wednesday, February 25th, 2004. A release date chosen with deliberate precision, timed to the start of the Christian season of Lent. Nobody in the industry knew what to expect. There was no comparable modern precedent. A violent, subtitled, self-financed religious film with no major stars, backed by a small independent distributor, Newmarket Films, because no major studio would put its name on it. It made over $23 million on its opening day alone, a staggering number for a film built on a foundation of universal industry rejection. It kept climbing from there. In North America, it earned roughly $370 million, a figure that would stand as the record for the highest-grossing R-rated film in U.S. box office history for the next 2 decades. Worldwide, the total climbed past $600 million. On a $30 million investment that Gibson had put up entirely out of his own pocket, the returns were almost incomprehensible. Because he owned the film outright, his personal earnings from the project are estimated to be among the largest single paydays in Hollywood history, reportedly exceeding what most blockbuster franchises pay their entire cast combined. Every studio that said no had, in effect, handed Gibson one of the most profitable independent bets ever made. What the numbers couldn't capture, but the story of the Passion of the Christ was never only a story about box office receipts. The controversy over the film's portrayal of Jewish figures in the crucifixion narrative didn't fade with its commercial success. If anything, the film's massive reach amplified it. Scholars continued to debate, in academic journals and public forums, how closely the film's choices tracked centuries-old patterns of religious scapegoating versus a director's sincere attempt at gospel fidelity. Gibson's own public standing would be shadowed by later personal controversies that reignited scrutiny of his earlier statements and choices, adding another layer to how the film is remembered. At the same time, for millions of viewers, the film became something closer to a devotional experience than a piece of entertainment. Churches organized viewings as ministry events, and many audience members described it as the first time cinema had made the suffering at the center of their faith feel physically, viscerally real. Few films in modern history have managed to be simultaneously a record-breaking commercial phenomenon, a flashpoint of religious and cultural controversy, and a genuine spiritual touchstone for a significant portion of its audience, all at once and all from a project the entire film industry had refused to touch.
Legacy. 2 decades on, The Passion of the Christ still occupies a strange place in film history. It remains the highest-grossing self-financed film ever made, and the highest-grossing non-English language release of all time. It proved decisively that a film built entirely outside the studio system, in dead languages, with unknown stars, on a subject Hollywood considered commercially radioactive, could out-earn films with 100 times the marketing budget. It also stands as a reminder that box office triumph and cultural consensus are not the same thing. The film's success didn't resolve the debate over how it portrayed one of history's most consequential and contested stories. It simply gave that debate a much bigger stage. Every studio said no. One man said yes anyway, and rewrote what an independent film could become in the process. Controversy, conviction, and all. If you found this story worth your time, consider subscribing. There are more forgotten turning points in film, war, and history waiting to be told.